Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to have back on the podcast Henry G. Henry was on the podcast about 4 years ago. We talked about his previous book, which covers all the different geological periods of the Earth. It is still, for me, the best book to read about a history of the Earth. I greatly enjoy that book. It's a small book, so it's very readable. Henry is obviously a fabulous writer, and I was very happy on that conversation. I still go back to that conversation, actually. But we did just over 3 hours, which I was very, very pleased with. I mean, you can't do the history of the Earth in under 3 hours, I don't think. So I was very, very happy with our previous conversation. He has a new book out. That book is The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. As a reminder, Henry is a paleontologist, and he's the senior editor for the scientific journal Nature. He has his PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he has written so many articles, so many books. And I was very, very, very happy to talk about his new book. We talk about the lifetime and decline of a species generally. So we kind of set it up this way. What does that look like? We talk about when humans begin to decline. Of course, we go back in time, all the way back in time, to talk about what does it mean to be a human? How does that, you have the great apes, you have, how evolution has carried us throughout. And so we have all the precursors. And so how do we know where is that first Homo sapien? And of course, no one knows, but we talk about some of the distinctive features. One of those features is we talk about bipedalism. Again, humans aren't the only ones that are bipedal, but what it looks like for humans, how it's got a lot of downsides for humans, actually. We talk about Homo erectus, one of my favorite human species, and slow human growth at first. We also talk about domestication and disease impacting humans. We spend some time talking about overpopulation concerns and low fertility rates. We, of course, talk about the impact of climate change and what that's doing for the future of humanity. And we talk about the future of humankind and where it could go, along with many other topics. Henry is always a treat to talk with. I love our conversations. This one wasn't 3 hours, but it's quite close to 2 hours, I think. So it's just under 2. It is fabulous as always. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. Also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share, contribute. All that's appreciated. And now I bring you Henry G. I am here with the one and only Henry G. Henry, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
You're very welcome. It's nice to be back again after all this time.
Yeah, it's been a few years. We talked about your previous book, which was fantastic. That was a very short history of life on Earth. I think what was the subtitle? Something about in 12 pithy chapters or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was like 4.56 billion years in 12 pithy chapters.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And of course, you've written numerous books, and you have. I guess the new one is sort of a sequel to it. It sort of reads that way, I guess. But the new one is The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. And I have to say, I mean, I love your writing, and it's always fun reading your stuff. This was a lot of fun to read, and I read it in a couple sittings, and it's good. It's familiar, and at the same time, you have like a fresh voice about talking about familiar topics. So it's all very, very worth it. Before we talk about the book, why don't you just give listeners a reminder of who you are, what's your day job, what you kind of do professionally, academically, and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, of course. I'm Henry G. I am one of the many editors of the science magazine Nature, and I'm based here in the UK, although Nature is a worldwide thing. I've been there for 37 years. And I cover the evolutionary biology and paleontology beat. But I have a side hustle of writing books. Ever since I did my PhD thesis, I always felt I had to be writing a book. As Xavier said, my previous book was A Very Short History of Life on Earth. And yes, my new book, the Decline and Fall of the Human Empire, is very much a kind of sequel to that book. And yes, I have I am a family man, and I have a wife, grown-up kids, and many pets, including my pet python Yentl, who is very pleased because it is the year of the snake, Lunar New Year, and he said his time has finally come. And yeah, that's me.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, you've obviously done your day job's great, and your side hustle is great as well. So for this one, I was thinking back. I didn't listen back to our previous conversation, but I do remember it well. It's one of my favorites, and I remember we sort of at the end, in that conversation and in your book, we talk about we kind of start from the beginning of Earth, and we talk about through the different periods of the Earth, which I really love that stuff. And I remember at the end of that conversation, you talk about we kind of chatted about what's going to happen to humans, right? What's going to happen to the human species on the planet, and how are we going to end? Are we going to end? Are we going to live forever? What's going to happen? And everyone's usually pretty cynical about it. I guess for this one, the story you tell in this book is how we become a dominant species on the planet, and we weren't mammals, largely weren't for a long time, for much of the planet's history. So how do we think about, broad picture, the rise of a species to become dominant, and then what's their eventual downfall? I think the easiest example we have is the dinosaurs. They were dominant, and then they had a pretty rapid, kind of event where they had their downfall. But typically, how does that happen for species?
It's been it's oscillated, this question about the lifetime of species, between a pressing issue and a non-question throughout the history of science. Back in the day, it was when evolution was kind of a new thing. It was kind of assumed that species had a lifetime like people did. They were young and vibrant, and then they had a middle age, and then they got old and senesced and died. It was called orthogenesis, and the life was seen as a kind of pageant of more and more evolved things coming and going. There was the age of fishes, and the age of reptiles, and the age of mammals, and then human beings came along. But then it was seen that evolution actually doesn't work like that. Evolution is based on chance and contingency and just random things happening. There is no order to evolution. And a paleontologist called Lee Van Valen said he came up with an idea called the Red Queen hypothesis. The Red Queen hypothesis basically is all about competition between organisms. Predators have sharper eyes and sharper teeth, but and because of that, the prey have sharper eyes and longer legs to run away. And the Red Queen is a character in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. The Red Queen says to Alice that to get in Looking Glass land, you have to run as fast as possible, and if you actually want to get anywhere, you have to run even faster than that. So that's where Lee Van Valen got the idea, and it followed from that. If you extrapolate that in the theory, that there should be no particular lifetime of species. Species could come and go more or less pretty much randomly. They could exist for a short time or exist for a long time. There was no kind of order to species existence, except that it's not true. There is an order to species. Species do have a lifetime. And if you want to find out what's going to happen to a species, you have to look at it when it's at its height, when it seems to be dominant. It's the king of the hill. It's the king of the swingers. It's reached the top and it's had to stop. And this was worked out by a group of scientists, mostly based in Finland, in Helsinki, who said that there are basically two things that govern a species' life. And one is competition with other species, and the other is the Earth, the environment itself. And to cut a long story short, once a species has run all the competition out of town, and it's become the dominant species in its particular group or habitat or where it lives, when it's become the dominant, the only way is down, because it cannot ever win against the environment, against the Earth. So if you're going to look at the history of a species, paradoxically, you don't time its death from close to the end, but you can kind of see the death with its cowl and scythe hiding in the wings when the species is at its height, and it seems to be doing its best and living its best life. And it's from that I got the metaphor of I started thinking about. I got the title, "The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire," because I'd read just in the past couple of years the great book by Edward Gibbon, "The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire," which is a 2,900-word epic written in
great book. Great book.
Yeah, the late. Have you read it?
Yes.
It's marvelous. It's written in the late 1700s by a nobleman called Edward Gibbon, who decided to write about the Roman Empire. It's a huge book. It's beautifully written. It's just, if you like good writing, you just bathe in this gorgeous prose from the 1780s, 1790s. I think that's the golden age of English prose. But he started talking about the decline of the Roman Empire. He started when the Roman Empire was at its height. He didn't start at the beginning. He started at its height. So he had a kind of instinctive knowledge about the Roman Empire that the Helsinki group applied to species in general. That if you want to look at the start of the decline of something, you have to start when it's at the top. And so that it was that philosophy that I applied to looking at my new book.
It's interesting when we started about humans. So there's not really I guess we don't have like a starting point for Homo sapiens, right? Evolution is a interesting thing, right? We have many progenitors, if you will, or precursors, and we'll talk about some of them. But, roughly we see humans, the human species on the planet around 50,000 years ago. And again, where does one end and one begin to be truly human? Who can say, I guess. But would you say that we're at our height now, or in the 20th century, maybe that's where we were? Or how do you feel where we're at, I guess, as a species now on the planet?
I can place it more or less exactly. We were at our height in 1968. And this is not because I'm some old hippie. But when I wrote I'll give you a bit of a history of how I come to write this book. When I wrote A Very Short History of Life on Earth, 4.6 billion years in 12 pithy chapters, actually, I gave you another billion for free. No extra money, still in the same number of chapters. So I looked at what would happen after the present moment. So I extrapolated into the future to look at the future of life on Earth and how it might develop and how it would end. And so when addressing that, I had to, of course, look at human evolution and human extinction, and I had to consider what the world would be like after humans were extinct. But I was a bit stuck. I didn't know, or hadn't thought or really thought it through how or when humans would become extinct. So I did a bit of hand waving, and in the book I said it was going to be a few thousand years or blah blah blah, and in the end I said sooner or later. So a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, Brian Clegg, who's a science writer. In fact, I mentioned him in the book. He wrote a review of my book, and he said, "Oh well, Henry ends with the comforting sooner or later." So I thought I ought to actually go and look at this a bit more. When will humans become extinct? What are the factors that could be involved in human extinction? And I actually found, to my horror, that humans were likely to become extinct fairly soon in geological terms. And I wrote an essay in Scientific American called "Humans Are Doomed to Become Extinct" in November 2021, I think, something like that. My friend Kate Wong, who is an editor at Scientific American, kindly allowed me to wax on the subject of human extinction, and she took out all the rude words, and it was published, and it caused absolute consternation in many different languages. If you look on the web about it, yes, you can see it's published in Czech and Polish and Spanish, and it got quite a lot of. It made people quite. It gave people a kind of frisson of horror. There are all sorts of illustrations of skulls and sand clocks and dystopian landscapes. So I thought, I am going to expand this into a book. So that's what I did. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw that humans have passed their peak, and we are going to become extinct quite soon. Within, I have to do a bit of hand waving. The next 10,000 years or so, after a long run up of 7 million. So that's what I did. But why do I say 1968? You're going to say, well, it was in 1968. No, actually, it's not quite 1960s. It's more like 1964 or the mid-60s. Generally, in the mid-60s, the human population was expanding at its fastest rate at about 2.3%. And in the 60s, that rate started to slow down. For the first time since the invention of agriculture 10,000 years ago, the rate of human population increase had started to slow down, and it had passed its peak and therefore was going to top out and go down. So that means that we, meaning humans alive today, live at a very, very special moment in our species history. The moment that the human population is past its peak and is going to decline.
It reminds me of the part of the book where you talk about overpopulation, which I've had many people, very concerned about this, and for some reason I've never been as concerned about it. But we'll get there. So I guess I kind of alluded to it a second ago. I mean, for you, there's no real start point, but what does it mean to be human? Now, many people will point to larger brains, and we're bipedal, and we use tools and fire, and these are some of the things that separate us. But we come from a big human family, right? We come from, you have Australopithecus. You mentioned some very interesting groups beforehand and kind of concurrently, but where do you see the distinction for Homo sapiens, humans? And you can talk about some of those changes, brains and teeth and bipedal, but maybe there are some other things that make us distinctly human.
It's very, very hard to say, Xavier, partly because it's we who are doing we are who are trying to find out why we are distinctive. We're trying to find it from the inside, if you know what I mean. It was a kind of a gradual process, what makes human. The 7 million years ago, there was a group of ape-like creatures who became habitually bipedal, and that led to the group of hominins, which is the human family, of which Homo sapiens is the only remaining example. Well, that didn't make us human because there were lots of other ones. As you say, there was Australopithecus and Homo erectus and Paranthropus and lots of other things. Homo sapiens appeared 315 million years ago, maybe a bit more. The first record is in Morocco. There are lots of skulls found at a place called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, which look like Homo sapiens. However, they don't much look like modern Homo sapiens. They still look pretty archaic. Big brow ridges. They haven't quite got the shape that humans had. And there are more recent examples of early Homo sapiens, 200,000, 150,000 years ago from Ethiopia that look much more human. One might say that it's a kind of cultural thing that defines humans. It's hard to say. Certainly, when Homo sapiens appeared, it was a very rough ingredient. It needed to be seasoned, and with a bit of admixture with other hominins that lived at the time. It used to be thought that modern Homo sapiens came out of Africa and displaced all the other hominins that were living elsewhere in the world. There was another view that said, no, Homo sapiens was an agglomeration of lots of things that lived all over the world, China, Europe, that sort of thing. It turns out there's something in the middle, that all modern humans owe their descent ultimately to populations that came out of Africa. But modern humans have a little seasoning from other hominins with which they interbred, particularly Neanderthals in Europe and Asia. In fact, all modern humans that do not have an exclusive, let's put it this way, all modern humans that don't have an exclusively African descent have a bit of Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of people in Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia have quite a bit of DNA from another human called the Denisovans that were the original Yetis. They evolved on the Tibetan plateau. Mm-hmm. And there are people in Africa who have DNA from a kind of hominin that is not known from any kind of fossil at all. It's only like a Cheshire cat smile in the DNA. Mm-hmm. So modern humans were a kind of mixture of humans, Homo sapiens, with a little bit of other things. But there's more to it than genetics. There's culture and population and the way we live. So one could say that the beginning of what we would now reckon as modern Homo sapiens began at the very southern tip of South Africa with the development of jewelry, body art, projectile weapons, a whole kind of cultural complex that happened 125,000 years ago in southern Africa. Then it disappeared. Then it appeared again 70,000 years ago. And then you might say that what we recognize as human is art rather than just chipped rocks, which appeared more or less simultaneously about 40 to 50,000 years ago in Southeast Asia and in Europe, with things like cave paintings of animals and hunting scenes and things that we now would resonate with, we would recognize as, we in other words, we can see we share the same minds as the makers of that art. It was not just random cross-hatching on bits of rock, which was what there was before. So it's kind of a moving target. I don't think there was it's not like in 2001, A Space Odyssey, which is a film I refer to quite a lot in the book. And you probably know the scene. There's the ape man who throws the bone into the air and it turns into a space station. Or it was the two groups of ape men and one wins over the other because it uses a bone as a weapon. And that was the spark of humanity. There was no particular eureka moment. It was a long series of developments, many of which need not have happened at all. It was a very, very it sounds like a very easy step-by-step process, the evolution of one to the other. But in actual fact, Homo sapiens had a very, very hard time. And for most, 98% of our history, we've been extremely rare and absolutely teetering on the edge of extinction for most of the course of our history. It's been a very difficult journey.
Do you think that I remember you must know the work of Peter Bellwood. He does this this work, yeah. And I wonder if the thing that makes us, hard to say, right? But one of the things, let's say, that makes us survive, or we've been able to persist, some people place 11 or 12 different types of human species kind of living at the same time, and then we are the ones that remain, maybe because of this mixture that we have Denisovans and Neanderthals and maybe whatever else we have, that it's all of this amalgamation of things that help us. It's like the right set of kinds of combination that help us survive. And it gives us a lot of setbacks too, let's be honest. But I mean, do you think there's something to that maybe the mixture of these things kind of helps put certain pieces together from others? I mean, hard to know concretely, but what do you think?
I don't think so, actually, because I think these other species also had mixtures of other species. I mean, there was mixtures of humans in human DNA and Neanderthals, and there are relics of other bits of species in the DNA of Denisovans, for example. So things were always a bit kind of mixed up. I think that what allowed humans to finally to succeed where others didn't was probably chance. It was probably luck, and probably one or two other tiny things that weren't apparent at the time. Chris Stringer and Clive Gamble wrote about this a long time ago, about Neanderthals, and they asked why humans succeeded where Neanderthals didn't. And it's partly because humans had a maybe slightly greater, any particular group of humans, maybe there was slightly more of them in any particular group than there were Neanderthals in groups of Neanderthals. They lived in larger groups, they had a larger home range, and they had a slightly higher rate of slightly higher success rate in producing children that survived to adulthood and could breed themselves. And looking at DNA that we can do now, we can see DNA of Neanderthals and humans. There seems to be a lot of truth in that. Humans were slightly better at producing more humans than Neanderthals were producing Neanderthals. And this wasn't because of any inherent smarts. It was just at the time they would have been tiny, incremental, infinitesimal differences. And if you'd been on the Earth 100,000, 120,000 years ago, you probably wouldn't have been able to say which human, if any, was going to take over the Earth, because all hominins, all species of humans, all lived in tiny groups where they were all vanishingly rare. All of them almost became extinct many times. It's now known that Neanderthals almost became extinct long before modern humans came along, but the home ranges of the extinct Neanderthals were taken over by Neanderthals that came in from somewhere else. And it's known that modern humans almost became extinct between 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, only little populations living in southern Africa. And there was a particularly awkward age about 1 million years ago. This was before Neanderthals and before modern humans became distinct. It was, in the age of Homo erectus or something like that. When for 100,000 years, or no, maybe for much longer than that, there were never more than 1,000 breeding humans at any one time in the entire world. And that caused a genetic bottleneck. That constricted the range of genetic variation that we see today in humans. In fact, it's because it's the study of the range of modern DNA that has allowed people to infer that conclusion.
Mm.
So it's a very, very hard question to ask. If you were to go back in a time machine, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be able to point your finger at any one group of hominins and say, aha, these are the people who in X million years will have 8 billion people on the Earth and completely dominate the Earth ecosystem, any more than any hominin or indeed any other animal that you could see in the landscape.
That's such a strange fact to sit with. It's all of these things about how we understand life on Earth now with humans, and it just that's such a interesting. It really does kind of show, yes, luck and chance, but also how tough living on the Earth can be. I mean, the environment and conditions can be pretty harsh.
And you can never tell, but what a change. Humans now sequester between 25 and 40% of all the production of all of photosynthesis on the planet. Just one species. 96% by mass of mammals is accounted for by humans and our domestic animals. Dogs, sheep, pigs, cows. All the other animals, from aardvarks to zebras, have to squeeze into the remaining 4%. 6 out of 10 birds that you will meet randomly will be domestic poultry. There is the humans by human activities now exceed by most measures the Earth's ability to sustain it. And and that actually gets more stark if you factor in climate justice, so that rich people who can have the capacity to shield themselves from the effects of climate change have a much better chance than poor people who can't. And if you were to factor in poor people who can't and try to save everybody, then we have well exceeded the Earth's capacity to sustain it. And this is strange when you compare us with, a geological eye blink ago when we were really tiny flea bites of species compared with all the other species living on the Earth at the same time. The rise of humans has been dramatic and seemingly inexorable until the mid-60s when it all began to change.
It's very, very interesting when we see this. So before we get to more current day things, you must, obviously you must know, Jeremy De Silva's work on bipedalism.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I know Jeremy, and I've read his book. Yeah,
his book's great. His research is great. He's great. Why did we, maybe why isn't the right question, but we're bipedal. We evolved this way, and we're not the only animal that's bipedal. There are other animals too, but how did evolving into bipedalism impact our skeletal systems, our continued evolution, how we give birth to other humans? We used to maybe had tails as a precursor. We don't have that anymore, in terms of the great apes and everything. But there's so many physical challenges with being bipedal. It's all we know, and there's some great things about it, but there's also some terrible things. People do have back issues. They have, hip issues. They have, all of these different types of things. What do you think about this big piece for, let's say, hominins generally, or for some of us that became bipedal, and that's how our way of being ambulatory in the world is? How do we see the positives of that? But then there's also some negative byproducts too.
Well, it's hard to see any positives, really. Actually, from hemorrhoids to hernias, the bipedalism has a lot to answer for. Some people who are even more miserable than me say coming out of the sea was a mistake, but that was that's something from Douglas Adams and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I'm gonna ask Neil Shubin when I talk to him again about maybe we should have just stayed in the sea. Neil, what do you think about that? Right?
I think we should have stayed in the sea. The sea is a lot easier. Most vertebrates today are fish, just as they always have been, and the vertebrates that came out of the sea and became humans, dinosaurs, aardvarks, zebras, We're just a very, very, very strange group of fish adapted for water of negative depth. But most tetrapods, which is basically four-legged land animals that live on land, the descendants of fish, have four legs. Tetrapods, the clue's in the name, right? And one leg at each corner. And it's a very stable way of getting around. I mean, insects have six legs, but four's pretty good. And some creatures have evolved to become bipedal. But bipedality has its costs and its problems. The most successful bipeds in the history of the world were dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were probably primitively bipedal, that is, they started off being bipeds, and the big ones went like, Brachiosaurus and Brontosaurus and went quadrupedal secondarily. But you get these beautiful theropods, from tiny velociraptors to enormous tyrannosauruses. Basically, they had a center of mass over the hips. And they still had a horizontal backbone. It was held horizontally in tension, and it was balanced. It was cantilevered by a long tail that balanced it beautifully. So essentially, there was no kind of cost to being bipedal. There were beautiful structures like Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, and they were just great. Hominins, in contrast, have done it the hard way. We don't have tails to balance with, and we have actually changed our backbone, the axis, the thing that we're built around, through 90 degrees, from a structure that was horizontal, held in tension, to a structure that's vertical and held in compression, which is not how it was evolved to be. Now, people have all sorts of after the fact reasons why we were bipedal, so we could free the hands to make tools, so we could see better over the tall grass, yada, yada, yada. Yeah. I came up with a rather tongue-in-cheek idea that we evolved bipedalism so we could show off all our softer parts to our prospective mates. But there's no better or worse reasons for that. There's the strangely persistent aquatic ape view, which is that we started to become bipeds and hairless and fatty and so on because we were wading around in the water. Well, it's an idea, but it's a hypothesis. It's cherry picked after the fact on certain bits of evidence, and all these questions why, including my own of waving our dangly bits at our mates, are the same. So you can't really answer why. It's the how that's the hard problem. But then you look at the context of apes. Apes are, particularly the old world apes. We evolved from monkeys with tails. They tended to lose their tails. The tail loss seems to be quite a thing. If you look at baboons, which are old world monkeys, they're large and quadrupedal, but they don't have big tails. They have little pigtails. But apes don't have tails at all, and they move around in a strange selection of ways. Orangutans, which are large tailless apes, have effectively four hands. That their feet are as good as grasping as their hands, and they move through the trees by grasping branches. Gibbons swing underneath trees using very, very long arms. Gorillas and chimps can climb in trees, but they mostly quadrupedal on the ground, and they walk on their knuckles on their hands, which is not known anywhere else in the natural world. And so when you think about all these strange ways that apes get around, humans walking on our 2 feet are perhaps no stranger, objectively, than any of these. The current view, I think, is that hominins evolved from a group of creatures that climbed around in branches, that kind of clambered around largely in an upright posture. So they were clambering around in branches. So being bipedal is a bit like clambering around in branches, only without the branches, if you can see what I mean. We were pre-adapted to doing that. A lot of refinement happened since, but as you say, it's not just a question of walking on your back feet. To do it of habit requires a complete re-engineering top to toe. I mean, you know of Dan Liebman's work on the Barefoot Professor. He's gone into this in enormous detail. It goes through our feet, our legs, the way our spine curves, the way our spine inserts into the bottom of our skull, the ligaments that we have that hold our head up so it doesn't droop forwards. Only ourselves and dogs have this ligament, and a lot of other things as well. And it goes with hairlessness and things like that, and all it affects. It requires bipedality. I mean, in one place I've said that human beings might seem rather ungainly and clodhopping, but in terms of locomotion, we are the elite fighter jets. We're the top guns of the animal kingdom because, any old animal can just stick on four legs and go along indefinitely. We're like DC-3 Dakotas. They can just keep chugging on forever. But we're like Top Gun because to keep upright and walk on two legs requires neuromuscular coordination of an unbelievably refined character. Because when you think of it, when you walk, you're taking one foot off the ground, you're completely unbalancing your center of mass, so you might fall over. And you have to put the other foot on the ground before you fall over. We take this completely for granted, and yet we live in this kind of perpetual instability. And scientists can look at many things. Scientists can look into the inside of atoms to the edge of the galaxy, but still nobody has really worked out how it is that humans can walk and move with such precision. It gets even worse for women, who for 99% of human history, women were there to have babies as soon as possible and to keep having babies until they stopped or died in the attempt. And if you're bipedal, your center of mass is raised up above the ground. And if you have a fetus in your tummy, that keeps changing your distribution of mass. And there are adaptations in the human lumbar spine that are adaptations to adapt to the load of pregnancy. So the ability of women to stand upright and walk along when they have to have this compromise between the hips being further apart or hips being closer together and this constant change of mass with the fetal load, it's really unbelievably remarkable. But we were bipeds. Why we were bipeds, I don't know. But as you said, it has very adverse consequences. Back pain is the single biggest cause of worker absenteeism in the world. It even causes problems in early life, such as the glue ear in human babies, in small children. It causes varicose veins in the legs. It causes edemas, pooling of the body fluids to the ground. We have to have all these valves in our veins so that all our liquid doesn't go into our feet. We have hemorrhoids, we have hernias, we have neck, spine injuries. Every time we walk, the shock of the impact goes right up through our spine to our necks and our heads, which doesn't happen in a quadruped. They don't put up with this. And then, of course, if we lose a leg or lose the ability to walk because we've broken a leg, we're helpless. I mean, everyone's seen three-legged dogs. They can run around just as well as four-legged dogs. But, as I found, and I wrote about this in my early book, when humans became bipedal and started to walk, they had to get very good at it very quickly because any hominin that lost the use of a leg would be easy prey. And I found this myself when I had a trivial accident at home in 2018, when I broke my ankle just slipping on the stairs. And I was cared for by an army of people who got me better. But if I were an Australopithecus on the savannah, I would have soon been eaten. That was that. So bipedality is bad news.
It's interesting also you're talking about is if you look at the parts of our evolved brains, so many parts of the brain are responsible for different aspects of movement. You have the cerebellum, which is for the control of movement, where we go. You have in the inside of the subcortical level, your basal ganglia, which is a system that has all these different parts that are for basically the executive functioning of movement, right? The sequencing, planning, organization to make a plan. You have your frontal lobes that are responsible for certain other aspects of directed movement. I mean, movement is in all parts of your brain for different things. So much of our brain is responsible for directed movement, control of movement, how we switch, how we change. And it's just a marvel how, it would be curious if we had the same amount of brain power, but less of it for movement, and we had it for other things, it would be very interesting. But it is for humans so important. One of my favorite human species is Homo erectus. I find the Homo erectus fascinating. I want to know. I wish we could get in a time machine and go back, but as far as we know now, again, all this stuff is always, kind of live, right? It's a moving target. But as far as we know, Homo erectus is one of the first to walk out of Africa. All right, and of course they didn't know they were walking out of Africa; they were just moving. But then it was out and back again, and moving back and forth, apparently. And there were all these changes, right? All these changes. But what do you think it is? Because to me, if you take like modern humans, and maybe you can extrapolate a bit, but one of the things about humans is we move. We're always moving, right? We're moving. You see many humans doing that. You see different civilizations and empires, and maybe some were static as well. But there's this interesting thing with humans about movement, and you can look at nomadic cultures from thousands of years ago that do this. And so Homo erectus feels there's something interesting about that. What do we know about Homo erectus, and maybe some of the ideas of moving and abroad upon the earth, and then how that starts to connect us with other types of Homo species that you mentioned?
Well, Homo erectus was in many ways the most successful human species that has ever been in terms of the longevity of the species. I mean, it originated 2.5 million years ago in Africa and disappeared maybe 100,000 eventually in Southeast Asia. So it was around for a long time. And the distinction between Homo erectus and earlier, not very well-known species of Homo, like Homo habilis, and basically Australopithecus, was the body shape. Homo erectus had an essentially modern human body shape. The Australopithecus had long arms, short legs, a rather pot belly, and a head a head that joined with a thick neck to the body, rather chimpanzee-like, and it could walk along. But what it probably couldn't do very well was run. Now, Homo erectus was a runner, and we talked about Dan Lieberman, who, for those who don't know, Dan is a professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard, and he specializes in human movement. And he's also a very keen runner, a barefoot runner. He's known as the barefoot professor. He does marathons in these kind of moccasins or bare feet.
It's 6 or 7 miles he runs a day. He told me this.
It's
something wild.
It's amazing, and he's my age. So
he's like in his 70s. I mean, it's crazy. He's very fit. So he basically teaches what he teaches what he preaches. He and his colleague Dennis Bramble came up with this idea that I was pleased to have published in Nature, to say that the main thing about humans was not walking but running, long distance running. And so the adaptations that Homo erectus had, or the change that Homo erectus had compared with earlier species, was its legs were much longer, its arms were much shorter, it had a waist and a neck, so that when it ran, its arms could be in counter phase to the legs. So when you run, you notice that your arms are out of phase with your legs, but also you can keep your head forward. You have a muscle on the back of your neck called the ligament, the nuchal ligament that keeps your eyes on the prize. And also, as your shoulders move, your head can stay looking in the same direction. Also, because this happened in tropical heat, there was a tendency to hairlessness and to sweating, and to not just running, but long distance running.
and also to a habit of hunting, because previous hominins were scavengers or vegetarians or opportunistic omnivores. They ate pretty much whatever was put in front of them. But Homo erectus tend to specialize in hunting. Now, the thing with humans is humans, compared with other animals, are very, very poor sprinters. But what humans are, even better than many animals, is very good long-distance runners. So and this still happens with hunter-gatherer societies today, is when hunters go out chasing an antelope, they will chase the antelope, and then the antelope will stop and run out of puff. And then they will keep chasing the antelope. Eventually, the antelope, even though it's faster over a short distance, will eventually fall over from heat exhaustion, and the hunters will catch up with it and kill it. There's a certain amount of cooperation involved in it, just as there are with, say, hunting dogs. So Homo erectus was a kind of hominin version of a hunting dog. We hunted in packs, and we ran and ran, not very fast, but for very, very long distances. It became endurance running. And so Homo erectus chased the game. It chased herds of game, and it was specialist for living in where hominins had always lived, which is the open savanna with a kind of mixed environment of savanna with rivers, with trees around the rivers, grading into sort of desert. And so, as you say, Homo erectus wasn't aware that it was leaving Africa. All it was doing was chasing the game out on the savanna, which extended throughout Europe and Asia into Southeast Asia. But what happened was with Homo erectus is that when it moved, it also evolved. It evolved into a whole range of different species. It was the kind of grandfather of all the species that lived since. It evolved into a huge range of modern humans, of creatures. It evolved into modern humans. It evolved into Neanderthals. It evolved into the Denisovans, who were the original Yetis. They evolved on the Tibetan plateau originally, the roof of the world. They evolved into these tiny hobbits that lived in the jungles of Southeast Asia. They evolved into Neanderthals, which lived most of their time in deep, dark caves and only came out now and then, and cultivated a very deep inner life inside caves. And Neanderthals were big thinkers. They had bigger brains than we have. So Homo erectus evolved into all this range of species, from troglodytes to yetis to hobbits. So a veritable Middle Earth of species all came from Homo erectus. Homo erectus was the first to create fire. It was the first to make these teardrop-shaped hand axes, its signature artifact. But it wouldn't have thought in the same way that we do. And you can see this from their hand axes. And this was an insight I got when I was a graduate student. I went to a seminar given by the great archaeologist Lewis Binford. And he said, when you go to some of these Homo erectus sites, you have hand axes just scattered all over the landscape, loads of them. Some of them, half made, some of them fully made. And it seems that Homo erectus had a program for making a hand axe. There was a sequence of chips to make a hand axe. And if it went wrong, they would throw it away and start again. They wouldn't adapt it. There was no consciousness to it. It was like birds making nests, or beavers making dams, or bees making honeycombs. Beautiful, beautiful structures, but largely hardwired. And Pat Shipman and Alan Walker, in their book The Wisdom of Bones, when they talk about Homo erectus, said they would look kind of human, but if you looked into their eyes, you wouldn't see humanity. You'd see a lion or hyena staring back at you. You'd see a savanna predator. So that was Homo erectus. And the first, proper modern hominin, I think.
Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. I find Homo erectus fascinating. You mentioned that, of course, there's all these different types of humans that come and go, and so we're kind of the last. You say that, populations of humans were really small. I think you mentioned that earlier. Why didn't they grow fast early on? Was it the environment and how things were, but we get to 40,000 years, we're the only ones around, and now we're up to 8 billion. So how do we start so small? We can't really seem to grow. 70,000, 40,000 years ago, but now we're at 8 billion. Like, how does that, what happens there?
Well, it's very interesting. I think it's interesting to ask why humans were always rare. I mean, okay, if humans were a top predator for a long time, well, top predators are always rare because that's the pyramid of energy going through an ecosystem. But humans only became top predators with Homo erectus. Before that, hominins were side issues on the landscape. Some of them, Paranthropus, were vegetarians. Actually, having said all this, when you say an animal is a carnivore or a vegetarian, most animals eat a mixture of things. There's a very interesting example I read once. Red deer, you think of vegetarians, on a Scottish island, actually get their calcium by eating seabird chicks. That they go to the most animals have a more varied diet than you think. But you think Paranthropus, it was a savanna grazing, root grubbing vegetarian, and yet there weren't herds of them like wildebeest or zebras or buffalo, in millions of them. There were only a few. And that's an interesting question. Why was that? Why weren't there enormous herds of hominins grazing over the plains? So I think that's possibly an unanswered question. I expect somebody will know the answer. But humans always lived in, like apes do, in quite small clans and family groups, spread very thinly across the landscape, occasionally meeting with other groups, where, as in 2001, they would beat their chest and throw bones at each other, although more likely they would meet up and say hello and tell tall stories and swap mates and have weddings and celebrations and trade information and goods. So humans were always spread very thinly. But as you say, the strange thing was how humans became had such huge populations. I think it began in Africa sort of about 70,000 years ago, probably when in the northern hemisphere that was largely covered in ice. And when the northern hemisphere was covered in ice, the Africa and the savanna was very dry and difficult to support populations. And that happened. It was interesting. Robin Dennell, in a book about how humans conquered Asia, said that that humans were affected by the ice age, even though they wouldn't have had any conception of snow or seen a snowflake or ice. So populations started to grow because there were more of them, but then at the same time, they were depleting the game reserves and they had to think of new ways to live. And this culminated in the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, which, but it actually didn't start like switching on 10,000 years ago. It started over 20,000 years ago. There is evidence from Israel, from a site called Ohalo 2, of a people harvesting wild grain with sickles 26,000 years ago. But agriculture started more or less the same time. There was a long run up from about 26,000, but about 10,000 years ago, you see agriculture kind of switching on everywhere. People always said it was the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. Well, yes, it was, but there was also independent origins of Africa, origins of agriculture, possibly in Ethiopia, in West Africa, in the southeastern United States, in Amazonia, in New Guinea. So everywhere you look, there were people who had settled down and they were growing crops and domesticating animals and becoming more sedentary. And we can go into the whole syndrome of agriculture. The reason is it started when it did was, I think, a number of reasons. The human population was growing at about the same time. You see that most large animals, larger than a large dog on the world, were driven to extinction. Now, after 10,000 years ago, there are hardly any mammoths, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, giant kangaroos, giant this, giant that. over the world. Now, human beings almost certainly played a part in wiping out the megafauna, but it was also prompted by climate change, not human-caused climate change, but because the Earth was staggering out of an ice age, and human beings were the victims of this staggerment and had to adapt to it. So when out of the ice age, humans came as farmers. So they didn't start off as farmers. They started off as sedentary hunter-gatherers, because hunter-gatherers don't randomly go out and hunt and gather. They know that at particular times of year, there's going to be game at this particular spot. There's going to be berries on bushes at a certain time. There's going to be particular food plants in particular areas, and they will have a kind of fairly predictable route to gather all these things. So what happened was people tended to settle in small villages and commute to their hunter-gathering. So the sedentary nature kind of began before the agriculture. But then what happened was they tended to scatter all the seeds of the things they were gathering near home, and they had inadvertently selected for wheat with grains that wouldn't shatter immediately as soon as you pick them, and so you could take them home. So it was kind of a gradual process. But there, one thing about agriculture contributes to the rapid rise of population is that a woman can become pregnant and have another child when her existing child is still kind of dependent on her. Hunter-gatherers who move around a lot, a woman tends to wait until one child is walking around independently before having another child, because you can't carry too many at once. But if you're living in the same place in a village where there are people to care, and you just put the baby down on the ground while you're doing things in the same place, people tended to have more children more frequently, and that caused a massive increase in population. Now the population increased exponentially, and it's in the nature of exponential increases that for a long time, it doesn't look it's changing very much, but then suddenly it shoots up. And so just after the origin of agriculture, the human population started growing, and it has been growing and growing and growing and growing and growing exponentially until the mid-1960s. The most important period in human history since agriculture.
So, yeah, I remember when I was talking with Peter Bellwood, he goes on and on about agriculture. That's kind of his thing, and really interesting how it went independently, just as you said, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, and Africa. I guess there's so many problems, though. Again, not the same thing, of course, but like we're so used to like being bipedal and it's great and all these things, but like we're so used to agrarian. I mean, many countries are still agrarian, have agrarian societies, but there's so many negative side effects too. You have famine, pestilence. I mean, I had this conversation with, is it Kyle Harper? He wrote this great book.
Yeah. He was on your show.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. We had a great conversation.
Just after my program was on.
That sounds right. It's around that time.
He talked about his book, Plagues Upon the Earth.
So good.
So I wrote a lot about that in my current book, and it's all down to you, Xavier.
Thanks.
I heard Kyle Harper on your program, on your podcast, on Converting Dialogues, and I thought, wow, this is great. So I went and bought his book, Plagues Upon the Earth.
It's great, isn't it?
I would recommend. He takes a gleeful, grisly relish in all these misfortunes that humans have suffered from. And he is Kyle Harper, for those who don't know, he's a historian at the University of Oklahoma, and he's a historian of diseases. Yeah. He specializes in things like the Justinian plague in the Roman Empire.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
But he sat down to write this book. It suddenly came to him that disease is a big determinant of human history, and just as COVID struck, quite ironically, he sat down and wrote Plagues Upon the Earth, which I would recommend everyone. It might be in paperback now. I have no idea,
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
I would recommend people go and read it. It's a despite the subject, it's a rip-roaring read. And
it really is.
I bought it and I read it, and I have to say, I do talk about it quite a lot in my new book. So, kudos to him and to you for introducing.
Thanks. Yeah. There's these people mostly think of agriculture and domestication of plants and animals as a good thing, and it is. But yeah, some of the work that Kyle did in the book that I just was crazy was this whole thing about it gets a little bit kind of gross of sorts, but fecal oral transmission was such a problem for hundreds of years for humans, and it's yes, figuring that out was really important, but we get that from how we have animals together with humans and all these things. And so anyways, there's all these negative side effects of agriculture. And I guess the question, from your perspective, you mentioned his book and his work. How did that, granted, we've had, most people know about the Black Plague and things like that, but there's how did it not slow human growth? You would think if it's just wiping out, a third of the population, all these things, and we still persist and we still continue to grow. How do we not regress back to just small groups again and not much, change? But we, in fact, went even further. Is that just technology that kept changing from agrarian to industrial?
I think it was all sorts of things. The thing is, once populations start growing, it's quite hard to stop them. As Paul Ehrlich says in his book, The Population Bomb, which I read, making babies is something that unskilled labor can do, and great pleasure in doing it. So that's people have always been making babies, but there were several downsides of agriculture. One was that people started living on a rather limited and not very nutritionally rich diet, mostly of starchy foods. Hunter-gatherers lived on a whole range of foods that they found in the landscape. But farmers started living on a rather limited range of food, and this led to a kind of malnutrition. So the early farmers are shorter in stature than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, and they also have tooth problems. They have dental caries, and they had stunted growth, and they weren't very healthy. And also, as you say, they started getting diseases from proximity to domestic animals. Now, hunter-gatherers, their interaction with most other animals is either they see them at a distance or they kill them and immediately eat them. So, except for the dog, which is people have had since 40,000 years ago. Not the same dog. It's a different. But then hunter-gatherers, like most animals, are afflicted with worms. Wild animals are full of worms of various sorts. But when modern humans started domesticating things, they lived in close proximity with their animals, with their cattle and their chickens, their goats, their sheep. And when I mean in close proximity, they really did. Even in traditional housing today, you find the ground floor is full of chickens, and on the top floor, that's where the people live. And where did flu come originally? From poultry. We have the avian flu crisis now. Well, that's where flu comes from originally. Human flu originally came from chickens. Tuberculosis is something we've caught from cattle. And there are various, and there are also various diseases that we got not from agriculture, but from the fact that we started to live in close proximity to each other. Viruses that spread through the air. These never get much purchase in hunter-gatherer societies because people live too far apart and they aren't very big groups. But there started to be diseases that were carried through the air, also diseases that were carried on the animals that took advantage of the localized abundance of human societies, such as rats and flies and fleas. So hence, plagues and yellow fever and malaria and lots of other diseases like that. And there is another thing about humans, which is because we were always rare in our past and were always almost becoming extinct, each succeeding human population was founded on a successively more meager pool of genetics. And the result is that even though there are an awful lot of us today, we are all very similar. Although we look very different, human skin color varies from pure white to deep black. There is less variation in the entire human population than in one small group of chimpanzees living in West Africa, because we have come through these genetic bottlenecks. This makes us very susceptible to disease. Carl Harper says, why aren't chimpanzees have got more diseases than they do? They have no concept of personal hygiene. They eat raw, uncooked meat, and they have snacks on their own poo. So, these are sort of things that we tend to discourage in ourselves, and yet we suffer the most enormous range of diseases. In fact, some of the diseases that chimpanzees have are caught from humans studying them, like respiratory syncytial virus and things like that. So Carl Harper he has a long list in his book of about 200 and something diseases of humans. So partly because of agriculture, partly because we live close together, and partly because we have a very limited genetic repertoire, humans are prey to the most extraordinary range of diseases, and yet we persist because we have started to live in large societies where boys and girls meet each other quite a lot and have babies. And it's interesting to think, though, that conglomerations of humans, particularly cities, until very recently were death traps. Until maybe 100 years ago, the populations of cities would only stabilize because of the people coming into them. If people didn't go into the cities, everyone would die of cholera or some plague. It's only since the advent of mass sanitation that cities have become places where people don't run a larger risk of dying from diseases than were they to remain in the countryside. So there we are. It is a paradox that humans have expanded in large measure, despite having backache and toothache and being covered in fleas, and present company except with backache.
So you tell us about the population bomb. This is this book that came out, and you can tell us about the major thesis of the book and why it was important. But I've had friends of mine that would say, we're growing too fast. We're going to overpopulate. We're going to go, 10, billion, 12 billion, 15, 20. Oh my goodness, all these worries, and it's going to happen quicker than it did at any point in history. And my reading of the data, the little bit that I've read, is that we'll peak at some point. Maybe it's 10 or 12 billion, and then we're going to go down. But even now, you see, for a variety of reasons, we have globally some of just the lowest birth rates. I mean, we have such low birth rates right now. People are not having kids anymore. I can't tell you the last person I met that actually had more than 1 or 2 kids. I can't tell you people that had 4 and 5 kids. It's so rare now. Whereas, when I was younger, you kind of meet that every now and then. Oh, it's a big family down the road or whatever. But nowadays, people are not having any kids. They're waiting till later in life to have kids. They're having 1 kid and that's it, maybe 2. And I have to, and from what I've read, this is happening. I mean, I think, Germany is becoming an older population. I think maybe in other parts of Western Europe, it's becoming an older population. Many states in the United States are an older population. And so people aren't just having kids, and there's not a lot of incentive to be honest. I mean, there's typically 2 factors that come into play. One is economics. It's expensive. It's extremely expensive to have children now. And second,
tell me about it.
Most people don't have, because with globalization and the digital age, people are able to live in so many different places and stay connected through the web. But now people just aren't living close together, so they don't have an aunt, an uncle, grandparents close by a lot of the times. And so, do you think all of these concerns about population, we're going to get too many? Are we already starting to see the drop off? Are we already? Is this just kind of a moot point?
this is such a, this is basically the central thesis of my book, so I could probably talk about it for hours, but I'll talk about The Population Bomb first, which was a book it was published in 1968 by Paul Ehrlich, who was then a young biologist at Stanford, and he was prompted to do it by a taxi ride through Delhi in India, where he just saw people everywhere. And from that single experience, he had this vision that this would be the world, quite soon. The world had about 3.5 billion people in it at the time, and the growth rate of humans was over 2%. It was the highest it had ever been, and at the time, it was really quite a concern. I mean, I was 6 years. I was a small child, but I remember reading in science magazines aimed at kids. I was always the nerdy kid, so I read the science. You were too, come on, admit it.
I totally was. Ask anybody in my family, anyone knows me, I was a big nerd.
So we would, back in the 60s, we were worried about overpopulation. It was a big worry that we would soon outstrip the Earth's capacity to supply it. So I actually got a copy of The Population Bomb, the original book. It was a really stinky paperback, cost me $60 secondhand. But I'm glad I read it.
It's out of print. It doesn't.
I'm not sure, but I got the first edition or an early edition.
Oh, nice.
It's a real polemic. I mean, it's really passionate, and he obviously meant it, and it joined other products of the 60s like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And it was all generally part of the 60s. I mean, people say that if you can remember the 60s, you weren't there. But, just the 60s was the most amazing decade. That's when people landed on the moon, which was astonishing. I mean, they sent them to the moon in things that had less brain power than a washing machine. And they came back again. And there was the explosion of popular culture in, Britain had Carnaby Street, and then there was Woodstock in America, and had the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and amazing fashions and the young generation and the 68 student riots and the Prague Spring and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh my goodness, what a time to be alive.
I mean, 67 and 68 alone was, 1968 historically is an incredible year for all the things that happened in it. Three assassinations in the United States.
So it was obviously, it was a very feverish time in the whole of human life. A lot of things were going on. There were a lot of technical and social, very, very rapid technical and social change. And in that context comes Paul Ehrlich with his book, The Population Bomb, saying that if we're not careful, we've got to start controlling the population. I don't think Roe v. Wade had happened then. I think it was in the early 70s, 71, something like that.
72 or 73.
He actually says it should be a right for women to have abortions, and Britain had passed the Abortion Act just before The Population Bomb had come out in 1967, but I think it was much more restrictive than it is now. And he was talking about the availability of contraception and so on. Then there was an article I read in the Smithsonian magazine talking about the population bomb 50 years on, and what had happened since. And evidently, the catastrophe predicted by Ehrlich did not happen. We have more than double the number of people that we have now. And in very broad brush terms, people are living longer, they are more educated, and they are healthier than they were in the 1960s. And there are a number of reasons for this, which we can talk about. But one of the technical things, which Paul Ehrlich does suggest in his book, which when he was writing his book, there was the beginnings of what was called the Green Revolution, which was the development in the Philippines and in Mexico with the help of some visionary American scientists like Norman Borlaug to develop strains of wheat and rice that were more productive than the ones that were currently in use. And these things changed everything. They fed the world and have done so until about now, when they're beginning to fade. So were beginning to reach the limits of the Green Revolution. So it was the Green Revolution that fed everybody. And in fact, there's probably now more food than there's probably enough food on the earth to feed everyone comfortably. The problem with food is its distribution, and rather than its production. There's an awful lot of food that's wasted and never gets to where it's meant to go. So Ehrlich's predictions, thankfully, didn't come to pass. And you could say that he sounded a warning bell, and people started to pay attention. But maybe it's gone in the other direction because, as you say, there does seem to be, and it seems to be increasingly in the news agenda, that we are depopulating. In Japan has always been the kind of poster child for this. Japan's birth rate is much lower than its death rate, and whole areas of Japan are being depopulated. There are a lot of older people in Japan. People are no longer having children. But it's not just Japan. And there's a figure we have to talk about here, which is called the total replacement rate. The total fertility rate, TFR. And that basically is the number of people a couple, well, it's specifically a woman because men can, have children with many women. So it's the woman who obviously has the child. So it's the number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. That's the fertility rate. And to keep a stable population, it's 2. So, baldly speaking, one boy meets one girl, has 2 children. And so that basically keeps the number of people the same, 2 parents, 2 children. Actually, the TFR to keep the population stable is slightly over 2. It's 2.1 because of various other factors, such as infant mortality or something, and there are always slightly more boys born than girls. So it's 2.1. That's the amount you have to have the population to be stable. It's now well below that in most countries. Now, there was a paper, one of the things that galvanized me to write this book was a paper that's available in The Lancet, and it's available for free by Volset et al. And it looks at the total fertility rate and predictions for the future in like 197 countries and territories. So not just a few, it looks all over the place. In fact, almost all places that they could find data. And the TFR is well below replacement in almost all of them. There are countries whose population, which if just left as it will go now, will be half what it is now. Half what it is now by 2100. I mean, some countries like Spain, Italy. Wow. I mean, Italy, the country that loves bambinos. Italy, they love children. Italians aren't having children anymore. They're just not having children. I mean, you said you hardly meet people who have children. I mean, I look at my cohort of cousins, and we're not having children. 2 or 3 generations ago, our great-grandparents had tons of children. I mean, there are a number of reasons for this. Economics is one, and there's underlying causes to that. But there was also something called the demographic transition. I mean, people used to have lots of children in the expectation that most of them would die in infancy. And now what with sanitation and medical care, we don't have many children in the expectation that they'll generally survive. And most children these days, thanks to vaccination, which I hope won't become ancient history in the United States, and
I hope not either.
Children generally die of rare genetic diseases or accidents. And they have a pretty fair chance of surviving to become parents themselves if they want to be. But then we come to economics. You say people are not having children, they can't afford it, they want to have careers, they want to put it off for as long as possible. And there are a number of reasons for this. Economics is one. Most people are moving into cities. Yep. And because most people are moving into cities and working in cities, it's expensive living in cities. It's increasingly difficult. I mean, for a moderately well-off middle-class person 100 years ago, they could expect to have a house and maybe servants. They would have a maid and a gardener. My parents' generation, they could expect to have a house, but they wouldn't have the servants. In my generation, I could just about afford to buy a house. My kids, who are 26 and 24, are still living at home. And because there's no hope that they're going to get anywhere soon. And I am not I personally am quite unusual. I pride myself in my uniqueness. I mean, there are two things about me. One is I'm unique, and that's also the second thing. But apart from that, there are increasing news reports about kids living at home, more or less indefinitely, until their mid-30s, certainly. There was an advertisement for a flat share in Toronto, and it wasn't a flat share, it was for one half of a bed for 500 Canadian dollars a month. So this is how difficult it's becoming. People say we can't afford to have kids. There's a good thing and a bad thing that underlie this. The bad thing is that the Earth is running out of resources. I think ultimately that's the cause, and that is exacerbated by climate change. And that means that there's less to go around, and so people have to work harder, work longer to basically stay in the same place. The good thing is female emancipation. Now, as we discussed before, for almost all of human history, the function of women has been to shut up and have babies, and that's it. And then if they survive long enough to finish having babies and not die in childbirth, they were there to be grandma and to look after their daughter's babies. And now you might say, before anyone says, "Gosh, Henry, you're a sexist pig," I would say, well, this is what happened in humans until, because I take a very long view, it was only an eye blink ago in history that we had female suffrage, that we had contraception, that women had any kind of choice or governance over their own careers and bodies. It's only, and even now it is not accepted universally that there should be a human right that any person should have total governance over their own body, whether they're male or female or whatever, that nobody should be able to dictate what they can do with their own body. Unfortunately, that doesn't yet exist. But because I take a long view, I'm quite cognizant that the benefits that we have from female emancipation can very easily be taken away. And it is because of female emancipation, it's the one thing, it's the single common factor that underlies increasing human longevity, health, wealth, and education. If you take in societies which are patriarchal, if they are wealthy, it's usually because of some highly serendipitous factor, such as the discovery of oil, or they're usually dirt poor and tribal. So the key to civilization, in modern civilization, I think, is the emancipation of women. It's the most important thing that can be done. If you are a person who is concerned about giving to developing countries some kind of aid, the most important thing you can do, and we did it in my family for a long time, was to kind of adopt a child. And you have your kid adopt a child in Kenya or Haiti or somewhere, and exchange, and you give money to the charity, and they will make sure that these children stay in education and so on. The other thing you can give to is to charities that provide clean water, because water is an increasing resource scarcity. So there we are. There are these two things so the population is shrinking around the world, even in places like China. That behemoth of China, they have their own overpopulation problem, and they did it in a they coped with it in a ruthlessly efficient way, which happens in China, which is having the one-child policy.
2001 is when they started that, or was it the 90s? I can't remember.
But anyway, they rescinded it.
I know,
now. But the problem is, the children are still not having any more than one child, because what happens is that you get used to a social norm. You mean you find a boy who has been the adored child of parents, who meets a girl who's the adored child of parents.
You have whole generations A whole generation of people like that. Yeah.
They will have one adored child.
Right,
Why would they
right.
have two? It's just not It's just not normal. And this is what you find with immigrant populations. You get people from countries where they normally have large families. They come to the States or to Europe, and they have the normal amount of children that you'd expect in the States or Europe. They have one or two children. So immigrant populations tend to normalize their social habits to fit in to the prevailing social customs of the host society. But yes, the population is shrinking. And it is shrinking in places. The overall human population is still rising. And it's still rising because there are some parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and a few other places in Central Asia and little bits here and South America and bits here and there, where the population is still rising because the population generally is younger. They are more childbearing age. But that's the only difference. The fertility rate is still going down.
Yeah.
And it will top out.
Yeah.
Nigeria is the most interesting example. That is the most populous nation in Africa. It has 200 million people in it. By the end of the century, it may have 700 million people in it, which is incredible. But by then, its population will cease to expand and start to contract. So what you have is a kind of, although the population is increasing over the world, it's decreasing in developed countries and many not quite so developed countries. And so basically a greater proportion of the human population is African, because if you were just to take that as the population. But by 2100, all countries of the world will be on a downward slide. By the last quarter of this century, by the 26s, 2070s, look, you talk to two demographers, you get three opinions. And, projections are very much based on the assumptions you put in. But all of them tend to show that by the third quarter of this century, the population will top out at 10, 11 billion-ish, and then start to fall. Now, coping with that increase of population is itself a big challenge, but then it will fall. And there are some projections that show that by 2100, there will be no more people on the earth than there are today. And then thereafter, it will fall dramatically. I mean, after that, it's very, very hard to predict. But there are some very, very brave predictions who said that by 2300, there could be as few as 1 billion people on the earth, which is the same number of people as they were in the 1800s when Napoleon Bonaparte was Napoleoning around and Jane Austen was writing her novels. Because it's far in the future, and it depends on the assumptions you make, the error margins are huge. But it's generally seen as a downward slide. So what you have now is, because of economic woes. Oh, the other thing. Our politicians are obsessed with economic growth. But you can't have economic growth on a planet which has basically used up all its resources, where the human population is has already stepped over the limits that it can tolerate of climate change, nitrogen deposition, water use, a load of measures. So growth is a kind of illusion. And, underneath all the, daily news cycle, the economy of the world has been static for 25 years.
Yes.
I mean, there have been some ups and downs, and, everyone remembers the 2008, financial crisis. But against all these various ups and downs, there has been essentially no growth since 2000. And that's because, that's all, folks, we've used everything up. But there is another thing which nobody's really talked about very much. We've talked a lot about women's health and women's reproductive health, which is essential to talk about. But there's also, it takes two to tango, and men's reproductive health has declined enormously in the past 70 years. Human sperm count, not just in the affluent West, but in Africa and China, has plummeted. And I've read quite a lot of very dry scientific papers about this. And even in the dry scientific language, you can see phrases like, this is an existential crisis in human. So even if boy meets girl, girl wants to have babies, man can't produce sperm that are viable. Nobody knows why this is. It's a mystery. There are all sorts of possible reasons, but of course, when you're doing this kind of study with human beings, you can't really test them. That's another reason. So for all these various, and then there's climate change, the big elephant in the room.
Of course.
So I can stop talking now and let you have a word in it.
Well, no, I mean, it's totally correct. I mean, there's so many things working against it, which, if someone has read your book, it's really not, I mean, in some ways it is unique, but in other ways it isn't unique to humans. We've always been at a disadvantage. We've always been just barely surviving. And we've been used to, being kind of at the top and very prosperous and all these things, but it is, if you take the long view, more or less, that's how it's been for humans. So, and of course, I mean, climate change is huge, and it's, you're talking about, the last quarter of this century going into 2100, and I'm sitting over here thinking, how many pieces of land are going to be left? They're either going to be underwater, they're going to be completely, scorched earth. I mean, there's so many challenges by 2050. Which is going to be difficult, which, I'll certainly, I hope stay healthy. I'll see 2050. And it's like, yeah, I don't know what kind of world we're going to have in 25 years. And
You got to read this book. If you haven't read it, it's by Gaia Vince, called Nomad Century.
Oh, very nice.
She's former colleague of mine at Nature. And she wrote this book called Nomad Century, which is a visionary book about how humans are on the move at the moment and are migrating because of climate change. And she's traveled the world. In fact, her handle on X, and if she's still on X, is Wandering Gaia. So she pops up from time to time. Now, there have been three great human migrations. One was Homo Erectus going out of Africa. And of course, that took a long time to happen, and they didn't know they were doing it. And then there was the second one of modern humans going out of Africa, which happened in fits and starts over 50,000 years. And again, they didn't know they were going out of Africa. Now we're coming to the third human migration out of Africa, which is happening all at once, and they know they're doing it. And equally from South America, from south to north, where there is global poverty, where people are suffering the most from climate change, from desertification, and from conflict. And increasing temperature, and desertification and temperature makes people cross and angry. That's kind of a hypothesis, but I think there is some work to show that when temperatures increase, conflict also increases. It's a bit vague at the moment, but there does seem to be in that direction. So people are fleeing economic hardship, conflict, and climate change, and are coming to cooler climes northwards. Now, because of the collapse of native population, governments, if they're wise, will welcome immigrants, and they will start doing it as soon as possible, because in a couple of generations, the supply of immigrants will run out, because the countries where they come from will have also topped out, and they will want people to stay at home. Now, one can overdo this. Most people, it's not the case that whole countries migrate. Most people in Venezuela, Colombia, Nigeria, Niger, Ethiopia stay at home. Most people do. And when people migrate, they tend to migrate to other places in the same country, or just over the border. Only a desperate few will try and make it to France or Britain or the United States, and cause the kind of brouhaha and political earthquakes that look, we have the Trump government in the United States that is very, very anti-immigrant. In Germany, a few years ago, the government was very welcoming to immigrants, but only today, and this podcast will be broadcast in a little while, but the day that we recorded it, a German political party has made a political alliance with the right-wing Alternative for Germany party, which is very anti-immigrant, which crosses a taboo in German politics since the war, and it's all to do with immigration. But I can tell you, you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen. No amount of legislation will stop you. No amount of walls, no amount of deportations, no amount of legislation, no amount of Colombian Air Force planes, no amount of turning people away in little boats in the channel is going to stop it. It's a force of nature. And I think if governments are wise, they will welcome them. The problem is it's politically impossible at the moment. I mean, I gave a copy of my book to my former elected representative, my member of parliament, who's a friend of mine. He's now, he's left he was voted out last time. But he says, yeah, it may all be very well, but you're never going to get elected on a platform that says you've got to support immigration. Unfortunately for them, that's a circle that has to be squared. Because
it's another wrinkle to it, right? Because immigration has all these issues and all these things, but it's like that is the big view of it in terms of global humanity. That is the big view that we have to have.
Well, but it's also one of the things I've noticed with a lot of these things is it's intensely local. I mean, in the book that I wanted to call Demure Mindfulness the Taylor Swift Way, but my publisher wouldn't let me, and so it was called The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire. I had a chapter on climate change, and I said climate change begins at home. I mean, I live in a highly eroding part of the country, and even now in my part of the country, there are climate change refugees because houses fall off cliffs. People can't get insurance for their houses, and so in my particular part of the world, which is in the county of Norfolk in eastern England, in my particular part of Norfolk, the constituency, you could say it was like the congressional area, it's like the parliamentary constituency of North Norfolk, has the oldest demographic in Britain. It's also got quite a lot of eccentric people in. I'm just by the coast, you know how it goes. All the misfits in the world move along until they get to the coast and they can't get any further, so they accumulate. And, you get all strange people and me
all the water people
living on the coast. Yes. But also you get a lot of elderly people. And also you find on the coast a lot of deprivation. I mean, it may look pretty, but there's a great deal of poverty. My wife is a nurse in the local hospital. She's specializes in, she's an ophthalmic nurse, and most of her patients who come in for cataracts and glaucoma and macular degeneration, they're in their 70s, 80s, 90s, they're over 100, and they're white, and all the doctors are Asian or black, and you get some of the people saying, oh, is my doctor, a colored person, so because there's a kind of racism here. And this is 200 yards from my front door. And then you get in the United States. Climate change climate change doesn't affect people living in mud huts across the other side of the world.
No,
Hurricane Katrina, it devastated New Orleans.
Decimated New Orleans.
It caused the greatest internal displacement of people in the United States since the Dust Bowl. There are refugees from New Orleans who are living 800 miles away and probably will never move back. And now because it generally, I have to be hit things on the nose here, because they generally concern poor black people. It probably didn't cause as much concern about the general fate of the United States as it should have done. But now we've had the LA wildfires, which one would hope would cause more concern because they affected a lot of rich, movie stars and people living in beautiful, it's such a shame. Pacific Palisades, beautiful part of the world. But then and you could say, well, New Orleans always had floods. It's always below sea level, blah, blah, blah. And that's true. New Orleans has had floods. I mean, that old song that Led Zeppelin covered, When the Levee Breaks, it's an old song. So, there's always been wildfires in Southern California. But the thing is, there are more of them, and they're more intense, and they're harder to deal with. And, old Father Thames, when I was a kid, they built the Thames flood barrier, which was this amazing structure. If the tide was high, this barrier would come up out of the river. And it was only going to be used once every 20 years. Now it's used 20 times every year. Because of climate change. And because most people, one of the first thing that, I know what defines humanity, going to the beach. As soon as Homo sapiens evolved, they went to the beach. And we still like living at the beach. Most big cities tend to be near water in low-lying flood areas. But New York is built on several islands in a floodplain, and it won't take very long for New York to be largely underwater. LaGuardia, JFK Airport will be underwater. United Nations building will be several stories, will be submerged, and people will get around by canoe or gondola or something. There are all, and of course, in hot countries where it's really going to hit. Now, in my book, I talk about various temperature records that have been broken. But by the time people read my book, this will already be old news, because I wrote my book mostly 2023, and I had a bit of chance to update it 2024, but I haven't been able to put that 2024 was the hottest year on record. But I did manage to get a couple of other things in that are quite salutary. One is that in 2024, there was a general election in India, the world's largest democracy, which is an incredible mass participation event. But while the election was going on, outdoor temperatures reached 50 degrees. And in wet heat, that would be, and election officials died. People died waiting to cast their vote. Yeah. And then you talk about another big human event, the Hajj in Saudi Arabia, where millions of Muslims go to, it's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is to go to Mecca. And when you go to Mecca, there are various things you do. There are certain events that happen outdoors. People have to go past and stone a particular pillar, and they have to circuit round the center of the Great Mosque 7 times, and there are other things, but they're outdoors. Now, the Saudi authorities know that with millions of people coming along each year, there are always going to be casualties. I mean, there have to be. I mean, it's just, will be there quite a lot of old people and people. What tends to happen in a religious festival with a certain amount of excitement and fervor, the old people will die. There will be people crushed. But the problem is getting worse because a lot of people have to stay outdoors for a lot of the time, and they just die of heat.
When you have temperatures that are 44, 46 degrees, I mean, that's a ridiculous heat.
So climate change is happening all the time, everywhere, and it affects us all. Whether we're, I know Muslims in Britain who want to go on the Hajj, they could do this. I live in Norfolk, which is a very erosion-prone area. People who I know have been, people have been affected by weather events that have been exacerbated by climate change. You can pretend it doesn't happen, but it does. So I remember 2003. Cast your mind back to 2003. You were about a young lad in 2003.
I was younger, yeah. I was late adolescence.
You were a young thing. I was a parent of 2 small children, and we went to Wales for our holiday.
Wales
now,
is great.
Wales is great. It is not known for its sunny weather. It is known, you always take a slicker and an umbrella if you go to Wales. But this is 2003. We stayed in a coastal resort for 2 weeks, and it was unbroken sunshine. It's just Wales. It was hot and sunny. Now, it's great if you've got little kids and you're playing on the beach with sandcastles. But we didn't know until much later that heat wave of 2003, thousands of people in France died of heat. It was a massive heat stroke. And years like that have got more common since.
Yeah, a couple years ago, it was in Spain where it was, 2 or 3 years ago, it was in unimaginable heat numbers. People were dying because, most people know that they don't have central AC in Europe.
No. It's
super hot.
All through the Mediterranean basin, it was like a hot zone, and there were kind of wildfires in Greece and other places. There's no air conditioning. In Europe, these hot weather events are becoming more common. Flooding is becoming more common. And also these tend to affect us more economically because we're more interconnected. I mean, we find the price of olive oil is almost unaffordable in our supermarkets. And the reason is the Spanish olive oil harvest has failed because it's too hot. It is and dry. That's why. So, climate change affects everything from, it affects you in your pocket because you can't buy the things because the things that you wanted to buy couldn't be grown or produced because the road has, become liquid or asphalt or, there's a wildfire or, as it may case in Ukraine, there's been a war, which has immediately affected the price of wheat because Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe. So anyway.
I guess all of these things, there's all these challenges, all these issues. I guess, the last question I have is there's just a generic one is, people read your book. What do you want them to take away from this one? About humans and how we've risen and how will fall eventually. But what do you want people to take away, I guess, from this one?
There are a number of messages I want people to take away. And increasingly, I think the message is the importance of immigration if you want your country to survive. But there is and also the importance of women's reproductive independence, which I think is the human population is going to decline, and the choices that women make are in part a cause of that. However, if we are going to manage our decline in any kind of civilized way, the women's reproductive independence is vital. But I think there's also hope because humans have also always managed to get out of trouble. I mean, we've made the point. Humans are bipedal and have backache, and then they had agriculture and had all these plagues and everything. But why we kept increasing? Well, we're very good at inventing our way out of trouble. Paul Ehrlich in the 60s predicted, the population explosion. Well, the population did explode, but there weren't the huge famines he predicted because of technology, because of the Green Revolution. But I think the last challenge that humans have to face is our own genetic impoverishment. That kills species. We are one population in one tiny habitat, the Earth. We are the dominant species in the Earth, and we are marked for extinction because of that, because of something called extinction debt, which affect when. And this goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning. When a species is at the height of its height, when it's at the apotheosis of its zenith, that's when you can see that's when fate creeps in and says, aha, I'm going to have you for my lunch. So we have genetic impoverishment. We've used the Earth's resources. So I think the next thing that people will probably need to do is go into space to maintain genetic resources by having different habitats in space that interact only occasionally to maintain the genetic health of humans. But the problem is, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a civilization of billions to raise, I hate to say it, but, a tech billionaire or a scientist who, a rocket scientist. In 200 years, we won't have those billions. We won't have that brain power to call upon because the population would have sunk. So if we are going to engineer our way out of extinction, we have to start thinking about it now. As Tom Lehrer said back in the early 60s, in the height of the Cold War, if any songs are going to come out of World War III, we'd better start writing them now.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things, and I guess the thing that I wish is that I wish we as a human species we have so much it's frustrating. We have so much more knowledge and information now than at any other point, and we just use it for nonsense half the time. And I wish we had more innovators, more creators, more people doing this. And there are people that are doing it. I don't want to say there aren't, but I wish we had more of that with all of that information. And we could probably figure out some of these problems a little bit better.
These problems are already being figured out. I mean, some joke said, we have the whole entire sum of human knowledge available 24/7 in our pockets. But what we do with it, we send pictures of our cats and have arguments with total strangers. But there are people working on artificial photosynthesis, which we will need to feed ourselves. There are people working on space technology. I dread to say it, but they're tech billionaires. I can't think of his name. Eric Tusk, something like that. I can't remember his name. Who are, love him or loathe him, and I loathe him. He is actually, part of the new wave of shooting people into space. I think going into space is nuts, but especially I think we're doing it. We need to do it quickly, but you have to carry us all with us, if you see what I mean. So there are people now. The cyberpunk pioneer William Gibson said the future is already here, but it's just not widely implemented. So there are all these things happening, and we need to put them together. But as a last thing, when I wrote a very short history of life on Earth, I said that if you're a student doing Dinosaurs 101, this book will do half your assignments for you, so you should buy 2. So with this book, The Decline and Fall of the Human Empire, you should also buy 2, because I need my retirement fund. But one to read yourself and the other to give to your elected representative, and to spread the word about the long-term and in some cases worryingly short-term problems that face us all: climate change, immigration, and how we must learn to look at the facts, look at the science, look at what it's telling us, and be brave and to grasp that science rather than to retreat to comforting shibboleths. And it's because I get the opportunity to talk with you and other people that I get to spread this word around and publicize it as far as possible. So there we are.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And as always, Henry, it's always a treat to talk with you. It always goes so fast. I always feel so enriched when we talk, and I'm very, very thankful for your time and knowledge and energy. And big thanks for coming on here again.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome, and it's lovely to talk.
Absolutely.